The coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor before he even understood why. Charles Ashworth stood frozen in the doorway of his own kitchen, staring at the new maid, who had just turned around to look at him for the first time. Her eyes. Those were her mother's eyes. But it wasn't just the eyes. It was the small scar above her left eyebrow, the one she got when she was 4 years old and fell off a swing at the park he used to take her to every Sunday. It was the way she tilted her head slightly to the left when she was nervous, exactly like she used to do when she was a little girl asking him if he loved her. 22 years old now, standing in a gray uniform with a name tag that said Ivy, holding a tray of dishes that trembled in her hands because the powerful man in front of her was staring at her like he had seen a ghost. And in a way, he had. Because Ivy was not just any maid. Ivy was the daughter he had walked away from when she was 3 years old. The daughter he told himself he would come back for one day, but never did. The daughter who grew up believing her father did not want her. And now she was standing in his mansion, cleaning his floors, completely unaware that the coldest, richest man in the city was the man who had abandoned her. Before we continue this story, if you are new here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this channel brings you the most emotional, heartfelt stories every single week. Please also leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe in second chances, drop a heart in the comments right now. And if this story touches your heart, share it with someone who needs a good cry today. Now, let's get back to the story. To understand how a father could stand 3 feet away from his own daughter and not recognize her right away, you have to go back 22 years to a much smaller house in a much smaller life before Charles Ashworth became a name printed on skyscrapers and business magazines. Back then, he was just Charlie, a young man working 2 jobs, barely making rent, married to a woman named Susan who worked nights at a diner just to keep food on the table. They had a daughter together, a tiny thing with big brown eyes and a laugh that could fill an entire apartment. They named her Ivy because Susan said ivy was the kind of plant that could grow anywhere, even through cracks in concrete, even when nobody watered it. She said their daughter would be just like that, strong, unstoppable, no matter what life threw at her. Charlie loved his daughter more than he loved anything else in the world. But love does not pay bills. And the pressure of being poor, of watching his wife work herself to exhaustion, of feeling like a failure every single night when he counted coins on the kitchen table, slowly crushed something inside him. He started drinking. He started disappearing for days. He told himself it was to find better work, but really, he was running from the shame of not being enough. One night, after a fight with Susan that neither of them can fully remember the details of anymore, Charlie packed a bag and left. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he would come back once he figured his life out, once he had something to offer his daughter besides failure. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And somewhere along the way, shame turned into avoidance, and avoidance turned into silence, and silence turned into years. He built a new life, a hard, cold, ruthless new life, climbing his way up through construction, then real estate, then finance, until the name Charles Ashworth became one of the most powerful names in the country. He built an empire out of guilt and ambition, telling himself every single day that once he made it, once he was truly successful, he would go back and make things right. But success is a strange drug. It convinces you that tomorrow is always the right day to fix your mistakes, and somehow tomorrow never comes. Susan raised Ivy alone. She worked 3 jobs. She never once told Ivy that her father was rich because she did not know, and even if she had known, she would never have wanted her daughter to grow up chasing a man who had already made his choice. Susan told Ivy that her father left because life got hard, not because Ivy was not enough. But children do not always hear the difference. Ivy grew up believing, deep in her heart, that she was the reason her father disappeared, that something about her was simply not enough to make a man stay. Susan passed away when Ivy was 19, after a long illness that drained every dollar they had. Ivy was left completely alone in the world, with nothing but a small apartment, a pile of unpaid bills, and a heart that had learned a long time ago not to expect anyone to stay. She took whatever work she could find. She cleaned offices at night. She waited tables during the day. She never finished college because there was never enough time or money for both survival and dreams. And somehow, through an employment agency that placed domestic staff in wealthy households, she was assigned to the mansion of one of the richest men in the city, a man named Charles Ashworth. She had no idea who he was beyond his name on a piece of paper. She had no idea that the moment she walked through those enormous iron gates, she was walking back into the life of the father who abandoned her 22 years ago. Now let's go back to the kitchen, to the moment the coffee cup shattered on the floor. Charles stood frozen, staring at her, his mind spinning through 22 years of memories in a matter of seconds. He told himself it could not be true. It could not possibly be true. Ivy was a common enough name. There were thousands of young women with brown eyes and a small scar above their eyebrow. He told himself this was simply his guilty conscience playing tricks on him because lately, ever since his doctor gave him a health scare 6 months ago, he had been thinking more and more about the daughter he left behind, wondering if she was alive, wondering if she hated him, wondering if it was too late to ever make things right. Ivy, on the other hand, had absolutely no idea why her employer was staring at her like that. She quickly bent down, apologizing for the mess, assuming she had somehow caused him to drop his coffee, even though she had done nothing at all. She began picking up the broken pieces of the cup with her bare hands, moving quickly, nervously, the way people move when they are afraid of losing a job they desperately need. Charles snapped out of his trance and immediately knelt down beside her, telling her to stop, telling her she would cut herself. Their hands nearly touched as they both reached for the same broken piece of porcelain. And for one brief moment, Charles looked directly into her eyes from only a few inches away. He saw it again. Susan's eyes. His daughter's eyes. He asked her, in a voice that did not sound like the voice of a powerful billionaire at all, but like the voice of a frightened young father, what her full name was. Ivy told him her name was Ivy Marlowe, her mother's maiden name, because she never used her father's last name, not since she found out as a teenager that her mother had quietly stopped using it too. Charles felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. Marlowe was Susan's last name. This was not a coincidence. This was his daughter. He wanted to say something. He wanted to scream her name, to pull her into his arms, to tell her he was sorry, to tell her 22 years of things he had rehearsed in his mind late at night, but never had the courage to say out loud. But instead, all that came out of his mouth was a quiet, broken whisper, asking her if her mother's name was Susan. Ivy's hands stopped moving completely. She looked up at him, confused and suddenly uneasy, and asked him how he knew her mother's name. In that exact moment, before Charles could answer, his assistant walked into the kitchen and announced that his business partners had arrived early for their meeting, completely unaware that he had just interrupted the single most important moment of his employer's entire life. Charles looked at Ivy one more time, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions she could not understand, and he told her, in a voice that trembled slightly, that they would talk later. Then he walked away, leaving her kneeling on the kitchen floor, surrounded by broken porcelain, and an unanswered question that would not leave her mind for the rest of the day. Who was this man, and how did he know her mother's name? That night, Ivy could not sleep. She lay awake in the small staff quarters at the back of the estate, staring at the ceiling, replaying the strange look on her employer's face over and over in her mind. There had been something in his eyes that looked less like curiosity and more like grief, like recognition, like a man looking at something he thought he had lost forever. She told herself she was imagining things. Rich men were strange, she reminded herself. Maybe he simply used to know a woman named Susan a long time ago, and her face had reminded him of someone. That was all. It had to be all, because the alternative, the tiny whisper in the back of her mind that refused to be silent, was too painful to even consider. Meanwhile, on the other side of the mansion, Charles sat alone in his enormous office, completely unable to focus on the business meeting that had just ended. His partners had left hours ago, but he remained in his chair, staring at an old photograph he kept locked in the bottom drawer of his desk. A photograph nobody in his current life had ever seen. A photograph of a much younger version of himself, holding a laughing 3-year-old girl on his shoulders at a small county fair, 22 years ago. He ran his thumb over the edge of the photograph and whispered her name to the empty room. Ivy. For 22 years, he had imagined this reunion 1,000 different ways. He imagined tracking her down, showing up at her door, explaining everything, begging for forgiveness. He imagined every version of that conversation except this one, where fate had placed her inside his own home, wearing a maid's uniform, cleaning up broken pieces of a coffee cup he dropped because he could not believe his own eyes. He knew he had to tell her the truth, but he also knew that the moment he did, everything could fall apart. She could quit on the spot. She could hate him. She could refuse to ever speak to him again. And after 22 years of silence, the thought of losing her again, this time permanently, terrified him more than any business collapse ever could. So instead of telling her the truth that night, Charles Ashworth, one of the most powerful and decisive men in the country, made a choice that would define the next several months of both their lives. He chose to wait. He chose to get to know her first, quietly, carefully, without revealing who he really was to her, hoping that somehow, some way, he could find the right moment, the right words, before the truth came out on its own. It was a decision built on fear disguised as love. And like most decisions built that way, it was about to cause far more pain than it prevented. The next morning, Ivy was surprised to receive a message from the head housekeeper informing her that Mr. Ashworth had personally requested she be reassigned from general cleaning duties to working directly in the main house, assisting with his personal schedule and errands. It was a significant promotion, one that came with a substantial pay increase, and normally would have been a dream come true for someone in her position. But something about it unsettled her. Rich men did not usually take a sudden personal interest in a maid they had only just met, unless something else was going on. She almost turned down the position out of caution, but she thought about her rent, her unpaid bills, the exhaustion of working 3 jobs just to survive, and she told herself that she could not afford to turn down an opportunity like this simply because of strange feeling. So she accepted. Over the following weeks, Ivy found herself spending far more time around Charles than she ever expected. She organized his calendar. She brought him coffee, carefully now, always double, checking the cup before handing it to him, half joking that she did not want to be responsible for another disaster. She noticed things about him that surprised her. Despite his cold, intimidating reputation in the business world, he was strangely gentle with her. He asked her questions about her life that felt too personal for an employer to ask an employee. He asked about her childhood, her mother, whether she had always lived in this city, whether she had any family left. Ivy answered carefully at first, unsure why any of this mattered to him. But slowly, without fully realizing it, she began to open up. She told him about growing up with just her mother, about how hard Susan worked to give her a decent life, about how her mother passed away when she was 19, about how she had been completely alone in the world ever since. Every time she spoke about her past, Charles listened with an intensity that unsettled her, his jaw tightening, his eyes glassy, as if every word she said was a physical blow to his chest. She once asked him directly why he seemed so affected by her story, and he simply told her that it reminded him of someone he used to know a long time ago. It was not exactly a lie, but it was far from the truth. As the weeks passed, something neither of them expected began to happen. A strange, complicated bond began to form between them. Not the bond of employer and employee. Something deeper. Something that felt oddly familiar, even though neither of them understood why. Ivy found herself looking forward to their mornings together. Charles found himself counting down the hours of his business meetings just so he could return home and see her. But there was another person watching this growing closeness with sharp, calculating eyes. Vanessa Cole, Charles's longtime girlfriend and the daughter of one of his biggest business partners, had her own plans for Charles Ashworth's empire, and none of those plans involved the maid suddenly becoming the center of his attention. Vanessa had spent the last 3 years carefully positioning herself to eventually marry Charles and secure her family's control over half of his company. She was elegant, intelligent, and utterly ruthless when it came to protecting what she considered hers. And she did not intend to let some nobody maid ruin everything she had worked so hard to build. One evening, Vanessa arrived at the mansion unannounced and found Ivy in the study, laughing softly at something Charles had just said, the two of them sitting far closer together than any employer and employee should. The sight of it sent a cold, sharp fury through Vanessa's chest, though she did not show it. Instead, she smiled a beautiful, dangerous smile and quietly decided that this problem needed to be handled immediately and permanently. The next day, while Charles was away at a business conference in another city, Vanessa summoned Ivy to a private meeting in the garden. She was polite at first, complimenting Ivy on her work, asking casual questions about her life. But slowly, the conversation shifted into something far colder. Vanessa made it very clear, in calm, precise words, that Ivy's growing closeness to Charles was inappropriate and would not be tolerated. She reminded Ivy that she was, and always would be, nothing more than hired help in this house, and that people like her did not belong anywhere near people like Charles Ashworth. Ivy, humiliated and hurt, tried to explain that nothing improper was happening, that Charles had simply been kind to her. But Vanessa cut her off sharply, warning her that if she did not distance herself immediately, she would personally make sure Ivy never found work in the city again. That night, for the first time in weeks, Ivy cried herself to sleep, the old, familiar wound of feeling unwanted tearing open once more. She began to withdraw, avoiding Charles whenever possible, keeping her answers short, her walls back up higher than ever before. Charles noticed a change immediately upon his return, and it worried him deeply. He asked her repeatedly if something was wrong, but she refused to tell him the truth, afraid of losing her job entirely if she admitted what Vanessa had said. Charles, unaware of what had happened, grew increasingly desperate to reconnect with her, sensing that whatever window of opportunity he had to finally tell her the truth was quickly closing. Then, one quiet evening, everything changed. Charles found Ivy sitting alone on the back steps of the mansion, staring up at the night sky, looking smaller and more fragile than he had ever seen her. He sat down beside her, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Ivy asked him a question that had been eating away at her for weeks. She asked him why a man like him, a billionaire with everything in the world, seemed to care so much about a nobody made like her. Charles felt his heart breaking in his chest. He knew, in that exact moment, that the time for hiding the truth was over. He took a deep breath, and with tears forming in his eyes for the first time in over 20 years, he told her that she was not a nobody. He told her that her mother's name was Susan Marlowe. He told her about a small apartment and a laughing 3-year-old girl on his shoulders at a county fair. He told her, with his voice completely breaking apart, that he was not just her employer. He was her father. Ivy sat completely frozen, staring at him as if the world around her had stopped spinning entirely. For a long, agonizing moment, she said absolutely nothing at all. And then, slowly, terrifyingly, she stood up, took one step back from him, and asked him, in a voice shaking with 22 years of buried pain, if this was some kind of sick joke. Charles told her it was not a joke. He told her everything: the poverty, the shame, the drinking, the night he left, the years of cowardice that followed, hiding behind ambition and success instead of ever coming back to fix what he had broken. Ivy's eyes filled with tears, but her voice, when it finally came, was not soft. It was sharp and furious, and full of 22 years of abandonment finally given a face and a name. She told him that she used to lie awake as a little girl, wondering what she had done wrong to make her father leave. She told him that she watched her mother work herself into an early grave, trying to give her a life, while he was somewhere building skyscrapers and shaking hands with powerful men. She told him that she did not need his money, his mansion, or his sudden guilt-driven affection now that it was convenient for him. And then she said the words that shattered him completely. She told him that as far as she was concerned, her father died the night he walked out that door, and the man standing in front of her now was nothing but a stranger wearing his face. She turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving Charles Ashworth, the most powerful man in the city, completely broken, sitting alone on his own back steps, crying like the frightened young father he had been 22 years ago. Please remember to like this video and subscribe if you have not already. It truly helps this channel more than you know. And let me know in the comments if you think Ivy will ever forgive him. Now, back to the story. The days that followed were unbearable for both of them. Ivy requested an immediate transfer away from personal duties, retreating back into general household work, refusing to speak to Charles unless absolutely necessary. She considered quitting entirely, but the practical reality of her financial situation kept her trapped in the same house as the father she had spent her entire life trying not to think about. Charles, for his part, did not push her. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that some wounds cannot be rushed toward healing. He gave her space, though every single day, the distance between them felt like its own kind of punishment, a constant reminder of everything he had lost through his own cowardice. But something interesting happened during that painful silence. Charles began, quietly and without any announcement, to change. He started attending therapy sessions, something he had never done in his life, telling himself for years that successful men did not need to examine their feelings. He started donating significant portions of his wealth to organizations that helped struggling single mothers, the very thing his own family had once desperately needed and never received. He never told Ivy about any of this. He was not doing it to win her back. He was doing it because for the first time in 22 years, he finally understood what his cowardice had actually cost, not just his daughter, but himself. Meanwhile, Vanessa, sensing that her plan to remove Ivy from Charles's life had seemingly worked, grew emboldened. She began pushing harder for Charles to finally set a wedding date, eager to secure her position before anything could change. But Charles, consumed by grief and guilt, found himself repeatedly delaying, distracted, distant, no longer the ambitious, easily controlled man Vanessa had spent years carefully managing. Frustrated and suspicious, Vanessa began digging deeper into Ivy's background, determined to find something, anything, that she could use to permanently remove this threat from Charles's life. What she discovered instead nearly destroyed everything. Buried in old adoption and welfare records from over 2 decades ago, Vanessa found documentation proving that Charles was not simply feeling sentimental guilt toward a random employee who reminded him of an old memory. She found the original birth certificate. She found the truth. Ivy was not just someone who reminded Charles of his past. She was his legal, biological daughter. Vanessa realized immediately the danger this information posed to her plans. If it became publicly known that Charles had a previously abandoned daughter, especially one currently working as a maid in his own household, the media scandal could be catastrophic, potentially damaging his company's reputation and, more importantly to Vanessa, damaging her own carefully built position as his future wife. But she also realized something else, something far more dangerous. If Ivy truly was his biological daughter, she could potentially have legal claims to Charles's inheritance, claims that could seriously threaten the fortune Vanessa had spent years positioning herself to control. Instead of destroying the documents, Vanessa made a far more calculated decision. She decided to use the truth as a weapon. She arranged a private meeting with Ivy, this time not to threaten her, but to manipulate her. She showed Ivy the old documents, confirming everything Charles had told her weeks earlier. But Vanessa twisted the narrative carefully, telling Ivy that Charles had known about her identity long before she was ever hired, suggesting that the entire job placement had been secretly orchestrated by him from the very beginning as part of some manipulative scheme, possibly to control her, possibly to quietly monitor her without ever intending to reveal himself at all, until circumstances forced his hand. It was, of course, a complete fabrication. Charles had no idea Ivy existed in his employment records until the moment he saw her standing in his kitchen. But Vanessa's lie was carefully designed to prey upon Ivy's deepest fear, the fear that she had once again been controlled and deceived by a father who cared more about appearances than about her. Ivy, already emotionally shattered from weeks of unresolved pain, believed her completely. The betrayal felt like losing her father all over again. Except this time it felt even crueler because it suggested that even his guilt, even his apparent kindness toward her these past few weeks, had all been calculated and false. That night, Ivy packed her few belongings, prepared to disappear from Charles Ashworth's life forever, determined never to let herself be manipulated by him again. But as she made her way quietly toward the mansion's side entrance, suitcase in hand, she overheard a private phone call taking place in a nearby study. It was Charles, speaking to his lawyer, his voice thick with emotion, instructing him to begin the legal process of formally naming Ivy as his sole heir, completely independent of any future marriage or business arrangement, explaining that he did not care what it cost him financially or professionally, because after 22 years of failing his daughter, the least he could do now was make sure she never had to struggle for survival again, regardless of whether she ever chose to forgive him. Ivy froze in the hallway, suitcase still in hand, listening to a version of her father that completely contradicted everything Vanessa had just told her. Confused and overwhelmed, she stepped into the doorway of the study, startling both Charles and his lawyer completely. In that tense, emotional confrontation, everything finally came out into the open. Ivy confronted Charles about what Vanessa had told her, and Charles, stunned and furious, immediately denied ever knowing about her identity before that day in the kitchen. He called Vanessa into the room immediately, demanding an explanation in front of Ivy. Cornered and exposed, Vanessa's calm, elegant composure finally cracked. In a desperate attempt to salvage her position, she admitted the truth, that she had discovered the documents, that she had lied about Charles's knowledge in order to drive Ivy away and protect her own interests in the family fortune. Her confession, filled with venom and desperation, revealed exactly how far she was willing to go to protect what she believed was rightfully hers. Charles, filled with a fury he had not felt in decades, immediately ended their relationship on the spot, ordering her out of his home permanently and beginning the process of removing her family's business partnership entirely, unwilling to allow someone so ruthless anywhere near his company or his daughter ever again. With Vanessa's manipulation finally exposed, the truth stood bare between Charles and Ivy for the first time. No lies, no manipulation, just 22 years of pain and one impossibly complicated love between a father and the daughter he never stopped thinking about, even when he was too afraid to prove it. Ivy, exhausted and emotionally raw, did not fall into his arms in that moment. Healing does not work that fast, and this story respects that truth. Instead, she simply asked him one final question. She asked him why. Out of all the years he had the money and power to find her, he never once tried, until fate accidentally placed her in his own kitchen. Charles, with tears streaming freely down his face for the second time in his adult life, gave her the only honest answer he had. He told her that every single year, he told himself he would find her once he built something worthy enough to offer her. A better house, a better name, a better life. But the truth he was only now brave enough to admit, was that he was never building something for her. He was hiding, using ambition as an excuse to avoid facing the shame of what he had done. He told her that no amount of success ever would have been enough, because the thing he actually owed her was never money or status. It was simply him showing up, 22 years too late, but finally truly showing up. For the first time since this entire painful reunion began, Ivy did not walk away from him. She stood in that study, tears falling silently down her own face, staring at the broken, honest man in front of her. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to actually have a father. She did not forgive him completely that night. Forgiveness like that does not happen in a single conversation, no matter how emotional. But she agreed to stay, not as his maid, not as an heir chasing a fortune, but simply as his daughter, willing to try one small, uncertain step at a time to rebuild something that should have never been broken in the first place. Please subscribe and share this story with someone who believes in second chances, and comment below the word family if this story touched your heart. Now, let's continue. The weeks that followed were slow, careful, and often painfully awkward, the kind of awkwardness that exists between two people who share blood and history, but almost none of the small, ordinary moments that build real intimacy. Charles did not push. He had learned, finally, After decades of running his life through control and command, that love could not be forced or purchased. It had to be earned patiently, humbly, one honest moment at a time. He started small. He asked Ivy if she would have breakfast with him, not as employer and employee, but simply as two people getting to know each other. At first, their conversations were stiff, filled with long pauses and careful, guarded words. But slowly, very slowly, something began to shift. Charles learned that Ivy loved to draw, a passion she had abandoned years ago when survival became more important than art. He quietly had an entire room in the east wing of the mansion converted into a private art studio for her, filled with supplies she could never have afforded on her own, not as a grand gesture to buy her affection, but simply because he wanted, for the first time in 22 years, to give his daughter something that made her happy, without any expectation of anything in return. Ivy, in turn, began to see glimpses of the man her mother once loved before poverty and shame changed him. She noticed the way his stern, powerful exterior softened whenever he was around her. She noticed how he remembered small details about her life without ever needing to be told twice. She noticed, slowly, that this man was trying, genuinely and humbly trying, in a way that felt very different from the cold, calculated world he operated in every single day. But healing, especially healing this deep, is rarely a straight line. One afternoon, Ivy discovered an old box of letters hidden in the back of Charles's private study, letters he had written to her over the years but never sent, dozens of them, dated across 2 decades, each one documenting a birthday he missed, a milestone he could only imagine, an apology he was too afraid to deliver. Reading those letters broke something open inside her that she had spent years trying to keep locked away. She confronted him that night, not with anger this time, but with raw, devastating grief, asking him why, if he truly loved her enough to write dozens of letters over the years, he never once had the courage to actually send even one of them. Charles, unable to offer any excuse that would soften the truth, simply told her that fear had controlled his entire life far longer than love ever had, and that he deeply regretted every single day he allowed that fear to win. It was in that moment of shared, unguarded grief, both of them finally crying together instead of separately, that something between them truly began to heal. Not because the pain disappeared, but because for the first time, they were finally grieving the same loss, together instead of alone. From that night forward, their relationship began to grow into something neither of them expected. Slowly, carefully, father and daughter began rebuilding 22 years of lost time. Ivy moved out of the staff quarters and into a private room in the main house, not as a gesture of status, but simply so she would stop feeling like a guest inside her own family's home. Charles began introducing her, cautiously at first, then proudly, to the people in his life, no longer hiding her, no longer ashamed, but genuinely proud of the strong, resilient young woman his daughter had become despite everything life had put her through. Months passed. The mansion that once felt cold and empty despite its size began to feel, for the very first time in over 2 decades, like an actual home. But just as their relationship began to stabilize, one final challenge arrived, one neither of them expected. A journalist, tipped off by a bitter and vengeful Vanessa before she left the city entirely, began investigating rumors of Charles Ashworth's hidden, abandoned daughter, preparing to publish a scandalous story exposing everything, framing Charles as a heartless man who abandoned his own child in poverty while building a billion-dollar empire, and only welcomed her back once guilt and public image became convenient. When Charles learned of the story about to break, his first instinct, decades of business training kicking in immediately, was to bury it, to use his legal team and financial influence to silence the journalist entirely, protecting both his reputation and, more importantly, protecting Ivy from public humiliation. But Ivy stopped him. In one of the most powerful moments of her entire journey, Ivy told her father that she was done hiding, done being something shameful to bury and control. She told him that their story, painful as it was not something to be ashamed of. It was proof that broken things could still be rebuilt, that people could change, that abandonment did not have to be the end of a story if both people were brave enough to fight for what came after. Instead of silencing the story, Ivy asked her father to do something far braver. She asked him to tell the truth himself, publicly, honestly, without spin or manipulation. Not to protect his image, but to finally take full ownership of the past he had spent 22 years running from. Charles agreed. In a widely watched press conference weeks later, Charles Ashworth stood in front of the entire country and told the truth. He spoke about his poverty, his shame, the night he left his family, the decades of cowardice that followed. And he spoke about his daughter, not as a scandal to manage, but as the bravest, strongest person he had ever known, a woman who had every right to hate him forever, but chose instead to give him the one thing he never deserved: a second chance. The public reaction was overwhelming, not with judgment, but with an outpouring of support neither of them expected. Thousands of people reached out sharing their own stories of estranged parents, broken families, and hard-won reconciliation, transforming what could have been a devastating scandal into one of the most emotionally powerful public moments of Charles Ashworth's entire career. But more importantly than any public reaction, that single act of honesty became the final turning point in Charles and Ivy's relationship. Standing beside her father in front of the cameras that day, Ivy finally, truly forgave him. Not because he was rich, not because of the mansion or the inheritance or the art studio filled with supplies, but because for the first time in 22 years, her father had finally chosen truth over fear and love over pride. 1 year later, the mansion that once felt like a cold, empty monument to Charles Ashworth's success had transformed into something entirely different. Laughter filled its halls. Family dinners replaced business meetings in the evenings. The East Wing art studio Charles once built quietly out of guilt had become the heart of a small, growing gallery showcasing his daughter's incredible talent, a talent she never would have had the chance to pursue in her old life of constant survival. Charles Ashworth, once known throughout the business world as cold, calculated, and untouchable, became known for something entirely different in the years that followed. He became known as the billionaire who rebuilt his life, not through another business deal, but through the simple, humble act of finally showing up for the daughter he once abandoned. And Ivy, the girl who once believed she was never enough to make her father stay, finally understood the truth her mother had always tried to teach her, all those years ago, back in that small apartment neither of them ever forgot. She was, and always had been, exactly like the flower she was named after. Strong enough to grow through the hardest, coldest cracks in life. Patient enough to wait, even in the dark. And resilient enough, in the end, to bloom. If this story touched your heart today, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to believe that it is never too late for second chances. Let me know in the comments which part of this story moved you the most. Thank you so much for watching until the very end, and I will see you in the next story.